This dude with his 38 flashy masks scammed over 3 million francs in crowd-funded charity cash across France after the war. He shredded that money, made a lion-shaped money mask, slapped it on his face, and danced like a crazy person, as if he was spitting in the world's face. These masks were his best armor. No one could find out his true identity or the purpose of his actions. Only those closest to him could barely see his sorrow and despair through the remaining half of his face behind the mask. This is a very long and complicated story. On November 9, 1918, the second last day of World War I, a military dog crossed the devastated battlefield and crept into a hidden trench. The bone-tired soldiers, some standing, some sitting, stared hard at the letter the dog brought. They were praying for news of the armistice. For long years of war had worn everyone out big time, and whether they were French or German, nobody wanted to pull the trigger on anyone else anymore. Lieutenant Pratt was the oddball. He was a war nut, hungry for power and money. He thought the more territory he grabbed and the more soldiers he threw into the meat grinder, the better his position would be at the post-war bargaining table. So, this guy, a real devil in uniform, flat out ignored the ceasefire order from above and gave the okay for a recon mission. He picked the oldest and youngest soldiers and forced them to crawl out of that trench and scout the front lines. Everyone knew how stupid it was to conduct reconnaissance in the enemy's area during the daytime, but orders were orders, and no one dared say no. A few minutes later, with 3 terrifying gunshots rang out, and young Talio got gunned down. Everyone went ballistic. Lieutenant Pratt had his excuse to start a bloodbath. In a flash, the battlefield was filled with gun smoke. The soldiers had no choice but to charge headfirst into the chaos, pushed on by the sound of the guns and the lieutenant's orders. In this godforsaken place where lives didn't mean much, shells could drop any second and blow these poor guys to smithereens. The only way to make it to the next day was to keep running and never stop. Albert was blown into the air. He rolled uncontrollably and actually rolled next to Talio. Even more crazy, Albert found that the bullet that killed Talio was shot from behind, which meant Talio was killed by their own man. Just then, Lieutenant Pratt, who was standing a few meters away, raised his pistol and fired at Albert frantically. Those who knew the truth had to die. While dodging those bullets, Albert took a tumble into a bomb crater. Lieutenant Pratt came after him, wearing a grin that spelled death. Out of the blue, a shell came screaming in. Everyone took off running. Just when Albert thought he'd cheated death, he got buried alive by the dust kicked up by that falling shell. Albert was sure he'd landed in hell, but when he opened his eyes, there was a horse's head right up against his face. He'd ended up in the same crater as a dead horse. A wild urge to survive welled up in him. He'd made it through 4 years of war without getting hit by enemy fire. With the armistice so close, there was no way he was gonna let himself get taken out by his own side's dirty tricks. That would be just plain dumb. So, he tore at the horse's thick lips with all his might, sucking in every last bit of that stinking, thin air, buying himself a few more precious seconds. And in doing so, he gave Edward a chance to come to his rescue. Edward and Albert were just fellow soldiers. The only thing they had in common was that they'd both given Captain Pratt a piece of their minds back in the trench. But that didn't stop Edward. With bullets flying all around, he dug his friend out of that makeshift grave with his bare hands. Albert spat out that foul-smelling air. Before he could even say thanks, a shell came hurtling straight for Edward. World War I ended, and Edward managed to pull through, but he lost half of his face in the process. After he woke up, he deliberately sent Albert, who was watching over him, away. Struggling to get out of bed, he flipped over a medical metal tray to use as a mirror. Then he pulled off the gauze on his face and saw a bloody, monster-like face. From then on, he couldn't speak and became a useless person who could only eat through a catheter. How could Edward, who had been a favored one and extremely talented since childhood, accept such a mutilated self? Albert saw what was going on and quickly gave him a shot of morphine, barely keeping Edward from falling apart. But every time he woke up, he'd just stare out the window, like he was thinking about ending it all. And whenever Albert closed the window, he'd lose his nerve and be stuck living in pain. This pain wasn't just in his head. Most of it came from the way his illness was tearing his body apart. The only thing that made him feel better was a lot of morphine. But the doctor was very stingy, and the dosage of medicine prescribed for him was not enough to resist the dense pain that came nonstop for 24 hours. The nurse was even worse. She just pointed at the cross on the wall and said, "Jesus suffered like this too." Albert had no choice but to sneak into the infirmary. He turned the cross on the wall upside down on purpose, stole the nurse's morphine, and injected it into Edward. Just like Edward had saved his life, he was gonna do whatever it took to ease Edward's pain. He'd saved his life, so now he felt responsible for him. For this reason, Albert wrote an application for transfer. He wanted to take him to a hospital in Paris where a chin prosthesis could be installed, so that when Edward went home, he wouldn't scare his father. All of a sudden, Edward got really angry, started yelling, and then scribbled on a piece of paper, "I don't want to see my father." Turned out, his dad had always been a touchy subject for Edward. When he was little, everyone told him his dad was super rich, but Edward thought his dad was a poor wretch who had never even given him a good night or a hug. And to make matters worse, his dad always shot him down, saying art was just a bunch of garbage. After his mom died, Edward lost all the love in his life. He grew up in his dad's coldness until he was 19. When the war broke out, he left home without looking back, getting away from his jerk of a dad who'd been holding him back, and joined the front lines. For him, dying on the battlefield was actually a kind of liberation. Watching Edward lose it, even motioning for him to kill him, Albert gave in. He decided to wipe Edward's existence from the records. So, Albert, who had always been timid and law-abiding, crossed the line again. Before the war patients were transferred, he mustered up the courage to sneak into the archive room. He found the record of a dead person who had grown up in an orphanage and exchanged Edward's identity with that person. After that, Edward vanished from the world and was reborn as a helpless orphan. Back in Paris, kind-hearted Albert didn't want Edward's family to get that cold, official death notice from the army. So, as Edward's buddy in the army, he sent them a letter and some of Edward's paintings. In the letter, he talked up how brave Edward had been on the battlefield. Looking at the paintings and the letter, Edward's sister broke down crying, but his dad didn't shed a single tear. He just stared at his wife's picture, lost in thought. At the same time, Albert started dealing with getting out of the army. He pushed his way to the front of the line, desperate to get that demob money and get him and Edward settled in Paris. The ironic thing was, not only did the staff give him a hard time, but after 4 years of risking his life for his country, all he got was 52 francs in demob money and 2 sets of used army uniforms sold to him at a cut-rate price. With prices skyrocketing, life was tough for these vets. But for Albert, the biggest headache was figuring out how to get more morphine. War left serious after-effects on these veteran soldiers. Most of them were disabled and needed morphine to relieve their pain in daily life. For those in a more severe situation like Edward, he developed a serious dependence on morphine during the treatment and couldn't get rid of it for the rest of his life. Albert used to be an accountant at the bank, but his job was long gone. No one waits around for a guy who's been MIA on the front lines for 4 years. To scrape by and keep Edward afloat, Albert took a gig as an elevator operator at an upscale hotel. All day, he'd just push buttons, shuttling rich guests up and down. But on his first day, there she was, his fiancée Cecile. Through the elevator's shiny metal, he saw her hanging off some other guy's arm, all smiles and batting eyelashes. Smelling the faint scent of high-end perfume on her, Albert finally understood why his fiancée hadn't replied to his letters. Such a luxurious life was beyond what he could give her. She spotted him too, but she acted like he was a stranger. When she left, she just slipped the engagement ring into his hand without a word. That was the end of them. Albert quit his job on the spot. But when he got home and saw Edward curled up on the sofa, seemingly waiting for death quietly, he soon regretted it. There was really no other way. Albert set his mind on the veterans in the city. He started snatching their morphine and hiding it in a secret place, and then giving Edward a dose when he was in pain. In this screwed-up world, good guys didn't stand a chance. Unlike them, Lieutenant Pratt was full of vigor. Just as he had originally planned, with his outstanding military achievements, he took a favorable position at the negotiation table and successfully obtained the contracting right of a military cemetery in Paris. which was responsible for providing burial services for the remains of the soldiers who had sacrificed for the country. However, burying the remains wasn't his purpose. Making money from it was his ultimate goal. He hired a group of illiterate cheap laborers and buried the remains randomly and chaotically. For example, a private belonging to the 6th Army was buried in the grave of a corporal from the 133rd Infantry Regiment. If anyone caught on, he'd threaten, intimidate, or bribe them into silence. He had plenty of dirty tricks up his sleeve. And just like that, he was living the high life while the other vets starved. One day, Louise, the landlady's daughter, bounded up the stairs with Edward's food and paper. But the guy she found was a whole new person. Edward was like he'd come back from the dead. He'd finally dragged himself off that ratty old couch and was standing on a rickety table, working away. Louise's arrival threw a wrench in his plans. Edward flew off the handle, dropping everything and barking at her to scram. But Louise didn't react. She stared straight at his face. Edward was infuriated. He took off his mask, trying to scare away this unfeeling girl. But instead of screaming, she reached out and gently touched his scars, her eyes full of pity. Edward was shocked by her kindness. He realized that not everyone in the world regarded him as a monster, as he had thought. In an instant, his empty, numb heart felt whole again. He'd finally found the guts to face the world. Then, something in the paper Louise brought caught his eye. To commemorate the great victory of the war and the soldiers who had sacrificed in the war, the city where Edward lived was going to spend a large sum of money to build a huge monument and carve the names of every hero on it. So there he was, half his face gone, holed up in a dumpy attic. But Edward decided it was time to expose the phony piece and shatter the lie. Albert dragged himself home, down in the dumps. Then he saw Edward, full of life, and it was like a punch in the gut, in a good way. He cracked his first real smile since the war. He was over the moon to see Edward back on his feet. Albert couldn't believe his eyes. Edward had made him an amazing gift, and he couldn't stop grinning like a kid on Christmas. But before he could be moved, he turned pale with fright at Edward's next plan. The two went at each other, unloading 6 months' worth of pent-up frustration and helplessness. All rationality flew out the window. Albert clocked Edward right in the face, busting a hole in his mask and exposing that gaping wound. In an instant, Albert snapped out of it, filled with regret. But it was too late. Edward covered his face and took off, disappearing for days. Albert was beside himself with worry, totally clueless about where to start looking. Life went on, and he landed a gig as a street salesman, billboards strapped to his body, yelling his lungs out. But you know what they say, what goes around comes around. The group of veteran soldiers whose morphine had been robbed spotted him. They quickly gathered around and started punching and kicking him. Albert, feeling guilty, didn't dare to fight back until the police officer in charge of maintaining order showed up and saved him. It rained heavily. Albert looked at his disheveled self in the mirror. Yet, he was worried about Edward's safety. He quickly put on the horsehead mask and rushed into the rain, searching everywhere for Edward's whereabouts. In his confusion, there was a strange noise coming from the landlady's house. Albert immediately realized that Edward was hiding by the window and peeking. So, he knocked on the landlady's door and, sure enough, saw Edward wearing a mask and looking unhappy. Albert threw in the towel and finally caved, agreeing to Edward's monument scheme. The sad face finally turned into a smiling face. Back in the attic, Edward and Louise got cracking. One was sketching out designs for the monument, the other cutting paper and putting together the catalog. Albert just stood there, totally at a loss, no clue what he could do to help.
Il dit que tu trouves de l'argent pour la fabrication des catalogues.
This was a revenge, a ridiculous confrontation between a dream and the absurd reality, and what's more, a revenge that was time-sensitive. They had to finish it before the National Day arrived. As soon as Edward finished explaining, he was hounding Albert to get moving. The so-called monument plan wasn't really a plan to sell the monument. Instead, it was to take advantage of the strong patriotic enthusiasm of the general public on the National Day. They would promote several design drawings of the monument through advertisements and then run away with the advance payments from everyone. This was a dangerous plan. A slight mistake could lead to complete disaster, which was why Albert had strongly opposed it at first. Even if he was considered a spineless coward without ambition, he didn't want Edward to suffer anymore. But now, as long as Edward could be happy, he decided to take the plunge. To raise the cash for the brochures as fast as possible, Albert strapped on 8 billboards instead of 2, leaving home before dawn and getting back long after dark, shouting his sales pitch until he was hoarse. Although he was very tired, whenever he heard the laughter coming from the attic, all his exhaustion seemed to disappear, and he was filled with new energy.
Monsieur Maillard? Vous me reconnaissez? Madeleine Péricourt, on s'était vu à la gare.
When he saw who it was, Albert shot to his feet, his eyes instinctively darting upstairs. He was terrified his secret would get out. It turned out that the woman was Edward's sister, Lena. A few months ago, after he sent them a letter pretending to be a comrade in arms, they had met once to deal with Edward's remains. Albert still remembered that under the threat of Lieutenant Pratt, he found a nameless grave and secretly replaced the nameplate with Edward's, managing to deceive Lena. The secret that Edward was still alive had to stay buried. Fortunately, Lena's purpose for this visit was to invite him to her home. With National Day approaching, so was Memorial Day. Edward's dad, who'd seemed so cold about his son's death, started losing sleep, poring over old photos of Edward as a kid. He regretted not bringing Edward's body home and felt awful that his son had left nothing behind. When Lena noticed how her dad was acting, she brought out the paintings Edward had done on the front lines. As he flipped through the portraits one by one, he seemed to see the soul of his son in the paintings, so vivid and brilliant. Soon, he found a small signature on each painting, which was Edward's self-portrait. His longing for his son suddenly surged like a river whose sluice gate had been opened and became uncontrollable. He desperately wanted to see everything and everyone related to Edward and hear about his son's deeds. Albert agreed to Lena's invitation. He even borrowed a decent suit and went to the appointment. But soon, he was shocked by the wealth of Edward's family. But things were about to get a whole lot worse. Albert, in his borrowed suit, nervously rang the doorbell. Then, following the maid, he stepped into the massive entrance hall and into the opulent reception room. Everything here looked very expensive. He couldn't wrap his head around why Edward had faked his death and walked away from all this wealth to live in squalor with him. But in an instant, confusion turned to horror. Albert was terrified to find a wedding photo of Lieutenant Pratt and Lena on the living room table. How could Edward's sister be with the very person who had disfigured Edward? It was beyond crazy, like something out of a nightmare. Albert was beside himself, dreading what Edward would do when he found out. He tried to make a run for it, but Edward's sister and father appeared in front of him. They greeted him warmly and, without asking, dragged him to sit down. They looked at him with great expectation, wanting to hear something about Edward from him. The meal was pure torture. One lie led to another, and he was drowning in his own deception. Lying was a difficult thing for the honest Albert. He desperately searched his mind and finally picked some of Edward's daily life on the battlefield to tell them. Edward hunkered down in muddy trenches, Edward sketching in the shadows, Edward pulling pranks. Mr. Perricott listened attentively and quietly to the words of this veteran, hearing about a living son that he had never really known. It seemed that at this moment, the details of his son's death had become less important. Just when Albert thought he had managed to get away without having to lie about the details of Edward's death, the old man sitting opposite him, who had been calm and stoic, opened his mouth.
Et comment est-il mort?
Une balle, monsieur, à l'attaque de la côte 113. Comme je vous ai dit, il était très courageux, alors il...
Albert's voice caught in his throat. The Battle of Hill 113, this word with a special significance, dragged everyone into the abyss of emotions. Silence fell, and everyone was lost in their own sorrow. Finally, Mr. Perricott broke the silence and calmly invited Albert to join the table. But clearly, in the old man's eyes, Albert saw the shadow of Edward, a sharp scrutiny, emptiness, and numbness. He stuffed his face, trying to focus on anything but the tension. The food was the best he'd had since the war, but he could barely taste it. However, Mr. Perricott and his daughter, through Albert's way of eating, realized that his life wasn't going well. So, they tactfully inquired about his current job. After learning that Albert had been an accountant, Mr. Perricott issued an invitation before he left.
Il se trouve que nous avons besoin de comptables. Vous acceptez un poste chez nous, les meilleures conditions vous seront proposées.
Albert was a bit stunned. He really needed a decent job. On the one hand, he needed to maintain a normal life, and on the other hand, he needed to help Edward complete his plan. But he didn't say yes right away. Instead, he walked out of the Perricott mansion in a daze and returned to the shabby attic to test Edward's attitude. Maybe Edward wouldn't mind getting some money directly from his wealthy home. In this way, he wouldn't have to worry all the time, worrying that the news of Edward being alive would be leaked and that he would run into that devilish man. But Edward shot down the idea in a heartbeat. He even said that his father was the only thief in their family, a war profiteer who got rich by taking advantage of the national disaster, and that he was a natural enemy to them. For this reason, Albert secretly accepted the job offered by Mr. Perricott. Then, taking advantage of his work, he stole the customer's money. For example, when a customer was supposed to deposit 60,000 francs, Albert only deposited 40,000 francs for him and pocketed the remaining 20,000 francs. Before the weekly reconciliation, the stolen money wouldn't be discovered by the auditor. Soon, Albert raised the money for printing the promotional album. Even though Edward was an artist, he'd inherited his dad's head for business. No matter how mediocre, ugly, or overpriced the monument designs were, slapping patriotism on them made them fly off the shelves. There was also a rented mailbox address on the promotional album. The subscribers would order the monument by sending letters. But for the next few months, they didn't receive a single order letter. Edward never expected his dad to be the first one to buy into the fake project.
Votre projet de monument commémoratif s'en est où?
D'accord. On en est nulle part.
After learning that the monument project had been stalled due to a lack of funds, his father sponsored the plan and was willing to pay a bonus of 150,000 francs to the winning monument designer. His only requirement was that the names of every martyr must be engraved on the monument. This was a father's selfish wish. He wanted Edward's name to be immortalized and for the world to admire his son. Of course, Edward wasn't about to let this chance slip through his fingers. Louise came by every day to help out. She loved seeing Edward come out of his shell, and she was fascinated by the wild, colorful masks he wore. As National Day drew closer, their monument scheme was on the verge of an epic twist. The man stood on tiptoe and pulled open the mailbox door. Countless letters spilled out and crashed to the ground, each containing a reservation check. As Albert picked them up, he grumbled about how insane these people were to fall for their scheme. He promptly opened a bank account under the pretense of patriotic memorials and withdrew all the money from the checks, 3 million francs stuffed into a leather suitcase. When he got home, the first thing he did was find the landlady and buy her foster daughter, Louise. He intended to take her with them when they fled, for she was the only one who could make Edward smile. While Albert meticulously planned their escape date and route, Edward seemed distracted, as if he didn't care where their future led. Sneaking a few stacks of cash from the suitcase, Edward crafted a lion mask from the bills, put it on, and danced joyfully. After a moment of shock, Albert and Louise joined in. The three spun to music in the shabby attic, as if they'd already escaped danger and were living happily in distant Africa. Suddenly, Edward's expression darkened. He smelled a familiar scent on Albert's borrowed suit jacket, his sister Lena's perfume. Albert's attempts to defend himself died when Edward confirmed it was a custom fragrance made for Lena alone. With no choice, Albert confessed everything. When Edward learned his sister had married the despicable Lieutenant Pratt, the demon who disfigured him, he was devastated. He collapsed onto the bed, put on his sad-faced mask, and sank into a morphine-induced sleep. Edward reverted to his former lifeless state. Albert's heart broke for him. Fearing Edward would waste away in despair, Albert went into the city to confront Lena and expose Lieutenant Pratt's true nature. But one glimpse of Lieutenant Pratt from across the street sent Albert fleeing in terror. Returning home, he found Edward dressed in bizarre women's clothing, determined to confront Lieutenant Pratt in his own way. They went to the pension administration and targeted an official from the honor roll, Joseph Merlin, an inspector who'd worked for 30 years without a promotion. He was either incompetent or an upright man overlooked for his honesty. But Edward bet on the latter. With a single anonymous letter, Edward lured Joseph Merlin to the cemetery overseen by Lieutenant Pratt. The letter accused a funeral company of using undersized coffins, 150 centimeters instead of 170 centimeters, to embezzle materials, stuffing them with fragmented remains. Joseph Merlin proved diligent, photographing each exhumed coffin. As alleged, most contained jumbled body parts, rendering the identified crosses fraudulent. He realized every marked cross in this cemetery hid an unknown corpse. Furious, Merlin vowed to right the wrongs and make the perpetrators pay. When Lieutenant Pratt arrived, Merlin ignored him and pried open another coffin, to find it filled with 100,000 francs in cash. It was more money than Merlin had earned in a decade. Would this overlooked man cave to temptation? From a distant hill, Edward and his friends watched through binoculars. Edward wore a repaired mask of his own face, but while it hid his physical scars, it couldn't mend the wounds in his soul. His sorrow only deepened. Meanwhile, the monument project advanced. 5 designs reached the final round, delivered to Mr. Pericot's office for his approval. Mr. Pericot paced slowly, hands behind his back, studying each sketch and sinking into thought. Suddenly, he leaned in sharply, staring at one sketch, then grabbed a magnifying glass to compare it with his son's paintings. The identical signature, Edward's distinct mark. How could it be here? Mr. Pericot immediately signed the check for this design, desperate to meet the artist, believing he held a connection to his son. But Jules de Spremont was a phantom. No such person existed.
Dans ce catalogue, ce sont des dessins industriels.
Lieutenant Pratt was roused from his mistress's bed with grave news. The official he'd bribed with 100,000 francs had turned on him. The upright Joseph Merlin had not only submitted a damning report but pasted every bribe note, 8 centimeters thick, to it and sent it to the cabinet. With irrefutable evidence, Lieutenant Pratt realized he was doomed. Even his loyal men abandoned him. In desperation, he begged his wife to intercede with her father, the wealthy Mr. Pericot. After all, the Pericots could fix his troubles with a single phone call. But Lena refused. She would not, and did not want to, get involved in her husband's scandals. To Lena, a woman of wealth and power, husbands were mere distractions. An unfaithful husband's only use was to legitimize her children. Now, his purpose was served. Lieutenant Pratt wondered why he was the one punished when so many had profited from the war. As he struggled, his estranged father-in-law approached, offering to fix his troubles if he found the con artist Jules de Spremont. Mr. Pericot couldn't explain his urgency. It was a hunch, a need to meet this man. Otherwise, he knew he'd regret it. Lieutenant Pratt, no fool, traced the trio to their abandoned attic. But when he opened the door, it was empty. Edward, indifferent to the world, had moved to a luxury hotel, hosting wild parties where he invented a game trying corrupt politicians who'd fueled the war. But after each orgy of drink and drugs, emptiness consumed him, relieved only by clinging to Albert, his last connection to humanity. Still, he suffered. As National Day neared and their scam unraveled, Albert planned their escape, while Edward watched them tenderly. His blue eyes, however, betrayed that his mind was not on the future, though no one truly understood him. On the eve of National Day, Lieutenant Pratt tracked Edward to his hotel and rushed to Mr. Pericot for reward. True to his word, Mr. Pericot called the minister to quash Merlin's evidence. Free from danger, Lieutenant Pratt's lecherous nature resurfaced. He accosted a maid in the Pericot mansion before even leaving. Albert witnessed the assault. Albert had fallen for the kind maid on his first visit to the Pericot home. He'd come to confess his feelings and, if reciprocated, flee with her for a new life. Instead, he found Lieutenant Pratt harassing her. Fueled by old hatred and new rage, the timid Albert resolved to confront the bastard. He followed Lieutenant Pratt to the cemetery and pulled a gun. As Lieutenant Pratt stumbled back, he fell into a pit of quicksand. The quicksand swallowed him rapidly, a grim echo of the innocent soldiers he drowned in lies and greed. It was a fitting punishment from a higher power. Horrified by the accidental death, Albert fled to a train station room to wait for Edward. But Edward would not come. Dressed in Albert's suit and a gorgeous peacock mask, Edward lay in the hotel chair. He only stirred when Louise shook him, like a prince roused from slumber. Mr. Perricott arrived with the monument sketch he'd purchased. He wasn't there to demand his 150,000 francs but to ask why the signature matched his son's. Their eyes met, and Mr. Perricott froze, as if choked by the truth. He recognized the sapphire gaze of Edward. He didn't reveal his suspicion, instead speaking as a stranger, but praising his son. "I am proud of my son," he said. Tears spilled from Edward's eyes, validation he'd waited 20 years to hear. In that moment, they let go of grievances, reconciling with each other and themselves. But it was too late for the proud, talented young man who could not bear his flawed life. Edward stepped back from his father's embrace and turned, leaping like a hawk diving from the sky. The sky was his destiny, and only angels could truly fly. Albert was arrested but freed by a police inspector, the father of Thériault, the first soldier killed in the Battle of Hill 113. The inspector let Albert go, allowing him to flee to Africa with his lover and Louise, carrying Edward's hope for a better life.